Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Rigor and flow.
Welcome back to another episode of Rigor and Flow. My name is Aiwan.
And I'm Tamanda. And this is the show where business meets love and culture meets critique.
It is. So today I'm going to share with you the routine of an author. I'm not going to give you his name.
Okay, but it is a guy.
It is a guy,
Okay.
so we've established that.
All right.
And he's an author who is world renowned and whose work have definitely stood the test of time. So he was supremely gifted.
Okay, but I'm not allowed to know.
Not for now, no.
Okay.
His books have passed down from generation to generation. Yeah, people just love him across generational lines.
Okay. Hit me with it.
So the author in question spoke about his writing routine
Yeah.
in an article that was written about him. And it went a little something like this. He would eat breakfast in bed and open his post. Then at 10:30 a.m., he would go down the garden to his writing hut where he'd write until 12 p.m., 12 noon, when he would then head back into the house for lunch, which was typically a gin and tonic. And
nice life if you can have it.
That part.
Okay.
Norwegian prawns with mayonnaise and lettuce.
Oh, okay.
At the end of every meal, he and his family had a chocolate bar chosen from a red plastic box. After a snooze, he would take a flask of tea back to the writing hut and work from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. He would be back at the house at exactly 6 o'clock for his dinner.
I have so many thoughts. I have so many thoughts. So many thoughts.
Okay. Tell me your thoughts.
Well, I mean, okay, where do I start? Let's start with the fact that I think you said he did a writing shift from 10:30 to 12.
Yes.
So he does an hour and a half in the morning before he eats his Norwegian prawns with lettuce. I mean, I already know
they sounded nice.
It sounds lovely, but I already know he's a white guy.
Okay.
Just from that. Like, I don't know if he's Scandinavian or what the deal is, but
Okay.
I'm already like, that's white man's food.
Okay.
We know he's a man. I'm pretty sure he's white.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you're going to tell me I'm wrong. He basically does...
It's Mark Morrison.
Did he return and was he a Mac?
He really was.
Okay, so it's not Mark Morrison, I'm sure of that. But he does a shift from 11:30... No, sorry, was it 11:30? Yeah, 11:30
No,
or
10:30 till 12, so an hour and a half.
An hour and a half. And then I think he toddles off, has a gin and tonic and his salmon, his Norwegian prawns. And then he comes back and does another shift from 4 till 6. Is it like, what is that? 3.5 hours
3.5
work?
hours of writing.
Okay, 3.5.
But to write books that have defined a
true.
generation.
That is
and
true.
stood the test of time.
And writing, 3.5 hours of writing is very intensive
Absolutely.
cognitively. It's
Yes,
demanding.
yeah.
But first of all, I look at that and I'm like, okay, is this like the 4-hour work day? Is this like Tim Ferriss before Tim Ferriss existed?
But instead
Tim
of a
Ferriss-
4-hour work week, it's a 4-hour work day.
Exactly.
Almost.
Tim was a skiver. He was a millennial. Like he was like,
Yes.
less work with this generation.
Absolutely.
So that's one question. And then my most resounding question is, you turn up for lunch at 1 or 12:30 or whatever time it is, and then you turn up for your dinner at 6 p.m. How many women do you have facilitating your life? Because I'm sure as hell you were not making that dinner and that lunch.
But you're having really strong thoughts about this author.
Well, all I can say is when I first ever went on a writing retreat where there was like catering and a canteen, I really realized what it was like to have someone make every meal for you and have your life facilitated. And I don't know, I feel like there might be some gender stuff here.
Okay.
Do you not think?
Well, I do think there is some gendered stuff.
Okay.
And there were definitely some women in his life who absolutely helped him to be the author that he was.
Do we know that for sure?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And we're going to say their hashtag say their names.
Say their names.
The names will be said at the end of this episode and we will give them their props.
Okay, fair enough. Okay,
Yes.
but before we get into who they were, am I allowed to now know who this like magical time unstrapped being was?
I think you are allowed to know. He was the great, depending on who you talk to, Roald Dahl.
Oh, Roald Dahl.
Yes.
That guy wrote everything.
Everything. He wrote The Twits, which I loved. He wrote...
Jameson the Giant Peach.
Yes.
Matilda.
Matilda, the classic Matilda.
Yeah.
Which has been on screen, I think, a couple of times now.
Yeah.
He wrote The Witches.
Oh, yeah, he did. Yeah.
He wrote
Charlie and the
Chocolate Factory, which is a classic. That's been made into film quite a few times.
Yeah, definitely.
He did the BFG, The Big Friendly Giant, which I loved.
Can I just say that all of these stories, I've got to say, he's been quite controversial as well. But
of course,
all of these books were literally the backdrop to my childhood.
Same.
Like my dad.
And you were raised in Botswana.
Yeah.
I was raised in the UK.
Yeah.
So it even transcended borders.
It 100% did.
Yeah.
It was like a huge export. And my dad, my abiding memories was having my dad read me those books every night. And I think I learnt to read through them because watching him read them to me, I learnt the shapes of letters and words and I taught myself to read. And it was through those books specifically and my dad's reading.
Yeah, it really is quite incredible. And I think he wrote those books on that routine, 3.5 hours a day.
That's wild.
And he's written, if you go through his bibliography, it is so extensive.
Yeah, I mean, for his generation.
I think there's a book called The Bitches.
No, are you serious?
Yeah, there's
are you sure it's not The Witches?
No, there's Bitches or something. I've got to look this up. But
well, talking about,
okay.
I want to know if there is a book called The Witches. But the guy has been quite controversial as well. I mean, there's been quite a lot of furor around his legacy to do with anti-Semitism. He was quite vocally anti-Semitic, I believe. And obviously people have made critiques of his gender. I remember there was some kind of controversy about his patriarchal relationship with his wife.
Yes.
So when I was saying who facilitated all this for him,
yes.
there actually I'm almost certain there has been some stuff because it came out in, I think 23 or 24.
Okay.
There was some news articles on it.
Yeah, we'll get back to them later on in this episode. So this episode is about time. Specifically the politics of time and our relationship to time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then, I want to know from you, how do you relate to time and specifically in your work? Because I feel like you have one of the most intense work rates I've ever seen. Like it actually is dizzying to me to watch you, particularly like when you're on production. So like, how do you think about time?
I'm going to speak mostly about the work side of things, the entertainment industry and the work that we do at II Studios. And one thing I will say is, and this is known across the industry, is that the amount of time we're given to produce things is so tight. Now, I know that, you could get to the end of a production where you had all the time in the world and still want more time. I get that. But ours are quite intense. The timescales are intense.
I've watched you on production.
Yeah.
And it's like frenzying.
Absolutely. And there's a reason for that. Every day that you spend on set costs a lot of money.
Yeah.
Because the moment you get to the production phase of a show or a piece of entertainment that you're creating, you've got freelancers. So you've got hair and makeup, you've got sound people, sound recordists, you've got camera ops, you've got DOPs, you've got...
What's a DOP?
A DOP is a director of photography.
Okay,
so they're in charge of how the thing looks on camera. So like what the lighting is going to do and so on and so forth. You've got all these people. You've got your producers, you've got your production assistants, you've got runners and so on and so forth. So, that's a lot of people and most of them are going to be freelancers on day rates.
Yep.
So you want to get as much out of those people as possible in that one day. Now, obviously, there are laws around how much time, particularly if they're unionized, then I think it's like a maximum of 10 hours on set. And then it goes into overtime, which costs even more.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So every day that you're on set costs a lot of money.
That makes so much more sense of the intensity. So those over 10 hours incurs like an extra charge.
Yes.
Now I also understand why the rate is so high of your work. Okay.
Yes, exactly. So you're trying to get as much done in that space of time as possible. And so then it leads to high workloads on non-union sets. those days can become 15 hours. I've easily done 15 hours on set because you were trying to get the most out of that day rate that you're paying that freelancer. I don't agree with it. I think a lot of needs to change. There was a recent film done by Joseph Morel for the film and TV charity that talks about working conditions on set. And I think more and more people are starting to challenge that, because as we saw with the recent case of John Balson, who was working on a Channel 4 production, and he committed suicide because of the intensity of the work, the burnout, the things he was being asked to do. It just all became too much for him.
Yeah.
And we can't have our creative people, our great minds, our people that are really dedicated to this industry getting to that point.
Yeah, I mean, the risk must be massively high for burnout and stress. And we've talked about mental health on this podcast before. And you know, when you're working at that intensity, the risk of not sleeping and then things like psychosis must be much higher, you know?
Absolutely.
So it's
when I'm on
quite
production,
scary.
I don't sleep as well.
I know, I've seen it firsthand.
And I physically start to break out. So I had like childhood eczema, which is pretty much under control. The moment I get on production, I get flare-ups.
Yep, I know, I've seen it firsthand. Suddenly you've got steroid cream out.
Yep.
I have now been around you long enough to have seen this happen several times over, and it's the only time your eczema cream comes out.
Yeah, it's intense.
Yeah.
It really, really is intense. And again, it comes down to that time thing. You're trying to get the most out of every hour.
Yeah.
And so it leads to this kind of inhumane situation. And I think the issue with that, and I want to give another story about a production that I finished recently, where the topic at hand was so heavy, like really highly emotive, going into places for the talent. So that's the host of the show, really challenging her to go to places in her personal life, her own
story,
the wounds of her life, you know, really, really heavy stuff. And it was a project where, again, we were probably doing a year's work in 3 months.
How does that even happen, that you end up doing a year's worth of work in 3 months? That's like quite inhumane.
It is inhumane. And there's kind of two sides to it. So on the one hand, I, as the senior producer, really should have looked at that schedule at the beginning and said, this is not possible. This is actually crazy. The only problem was we were on a production where there were 2 black production companies with a black creator making something for a massive broadcaster. And that is unprecedented. You don't really get that very often. And so sometimes it can feel like this is our one shot. If we start pushing back against this, will we ever be allowed to do this again in the way that we're doing it with this particular team of people? If we push back, will they see us as maybe not as effective or not as committed, and so on and so forth? So then we as a collective made a decision to just go ahead and do the project.
But hold on a second, even before you get into that, that's you saying as a producer, I should have looked at the schedule. But the question is, who even created that schedule in the first place? And how did that come to be? Because it shouldn't come, as a producer, surely it shouldn't come down to you. I get the dynamics of being black companies, but
yes.
Tell me how it even became that.
So the schedule was created in absence of me. I was presented with the schedule.
Yeah.
And in that production, I wasn't senior enough to have created that schedule, if that makes sense. But I could feed into it.
Okay.
So I arrived at that schedule, and we kind of always knew we have to get this thing out by this point.
Okay.
Which was Black History Month.
Okay. So that's the thing that I wanted to understand, right? So I'm trying to, you still haven't answered. Maybe it's because you don't want to give anything away. Okay.
Treading carefully.
You're treading carefully, right? Yeah. But the bottom line is there were things that were influencing the timeline this thing happened. And one of them was there's a calendar or a proposed release date.
Yes.
However, surely in a production of a significant size with a big client, people know how long these things take. So if they knew the thing was Black History Month, for example, why was it only 3 months given?
Okay, so the getting to that point of starting took a long time. There were protracted negotiations and all of that good stuff. And then suddenly out of the blue,
how long were the negotiations?
Almost 2 years.
Okay.
And then suddenly out of the blue, things had been signed off and it was like, right, go, 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 go. We need this thing yesterday.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I get that.
Yes.
So basically what happened was it was meant to start sooner.
Yes.
It started delayed.
Yes.
and
But we
then
still kept the same calendar,
the same schedule. Okay.
based on that calendar event.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah. So then time gets compressed. And suddenly it's like, we still got to do it. Let's
Okay.
go. As it was, it ended up not coming out for Black History Month because it just wasn't, it wasn't feasible.
Okay.
And the schedule had to get extended slightly. And so it came out for another calendar event instead.
But nonetheless, while you were on that production,
Yes.
how long did it take in the end?
It took about 4 months.
Okay, so you still did 12 months worth of work in 4 months.
Yeah.
What was that like for you and the
About
rest
4.5
of
months.
the team?
Intense. Not only is the content already heavy
Yeah.
and emotive, but now you've got this time pressure. And obviously you've got people coming together who've never worked together.
Yep.
So you're trying to figure out a new dynamic, a new way of working together, which is always tricky because
Yeah.
human beings are human
Takes
beings.
time
It takes
to
time.
build relationships.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And work out the kinks of that working relationship. But we're under pressure. And obviously there's a lot of travel involved. We had to travel around the country, had to travel outside of the country. And so it was just pressure. It was a lot of pressure. And it felt like we didn't have time to go as deep as we wanted on certain aspects of the story because of the time pressure.
So do you think the story suffered as well as you guys?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we are professionals and
Yeah.
we know how to get the best out of any given situation, but it always remains that the more you can go deep, the more time you have to sit with the topic matter, the more it percolates in your mind and then dots form.
Yeah.
And then dots connect. Do you
Totally.
see what I mean?
No, I feel
you
that.
can
It
see
happens with
things.
research.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you need that space for your brain to process what you've given it, make those connections, which in turn makes the story richer and deeper.
Yeah. And sometimes, I don't know if it's anything like research, but it's not necessarily time on set or on production. It's probably the space between different shoot days
Yes.
or between doing a set of activities to just let things settle
Absolutely.
and just allow things to emerge in their own time, in the time of the story wants to be told itself. You know?
Absolutely. And I remember there was this one period where we did end up having a bit of a break. And I remember suddenly just connections being made. And I remember texting talent going, oh my God, what about this? And we could do this. And what do you think about that? And isn't it interesting what this person said that relates to this thing over here? Maybe we should explore this line of research. And it was a blip. And we both looked at each other and we were like, imagine if we had this throughout the whole process, the writing process.
Yeah. The full 12 months that you might have had.
Yeah.
Wow.
But then the full 12 months costs a lot of money.
No, I hear that.
Because then you're paying someone basically a salary.
But could you not spread production out? It doesn't have to cost. It could just be like if there had been a different scenario.
You could do, but then the other problem is that as freelancers, other projects come up.
That's true.
Part of the reason
And then
why I
your
eventually had to
availability.
draw a line on it was I've got production starting. I have to move on.
Yeah.
So it has to end. So
Okay.
that was another issue as well that you sometimes face.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I want to go back to that thing you said about you received this timeline that had been made and you were in this situation. You had a big company, big client, and you had two Black production companies working on this thing.
Yeah.
And you felt like you couldn't, you said, I should have been able to
Yeah.
go, oh, this isn't achievable.
Yes.
But you didn't. Can you tell me more about that?
I mean, it's just the age-old thing, isn't it? When you're in those situations, how do you... Power is what I would say. You're sometimes a bit of a little cog in a really big machine. And it's almost like you're saying, machine, stop, because we need more time. And the machine's like, what? No, this is how it works.
Yeah. Yeah.
Keep going.
The wheels are already in motion.
Right, you can feel that internally.
Yeah.
Whether it's true or not externally is another matter, but certainly you can feel that.
Yeah.
And if you add race into the mix and how many of our stories they even tell or commission, then you can almost feel like this is the moment. So just go for it and do it.
Yeah.
You know?
So there's this pressure of like, we as a community can't afford to lose this opportunity.
That part.
And then on top of it, I also like wonder if there's a thing about Black people often get stereotyped, often incorrectly, for being slow, behind time, late.
Yes.
And so you don't want to be like, hey, by the way, this is inhumane because it maybe makes you look less professional,
lazy. Yeah, or lazy,
or something.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's maybe something that I probably have internalized, which might also be why I
you
work
have a mad work rate.
the way I work. Yeah.
What I find so fascinating about that is, normally there's this commonly said thing in the Black community that we always have to work twice as hard to get any recognition. But you're sitting there in that situation going, I don't want to look unprofessional, so I'm not going to raise this thing. But in reality, what you're saying is you had to work 4 times as hard.
Essentially.
Because in 3 months, you had to do what would have been done in 12.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it is, there's such a racialized dynamic to even what's going on in that situation.
Absolutely. One of the interesting things about this particular project was the talent. We call the people who are in front of the camera or in front of the mic talent. That's where that comes from. But the talent on this particular project is a trained mental health professional, has done a lot of work in the realm of like rest and so on and so forth. And they approach this production with the thing of, this has to be not brutal or inhumane.
Yeah.
I want there to be elements of rest incorporated into the schedule.
Yeah.
And I want the crew to be treated humanely.
Mm-hmm.
And I want this to be a production that is holistic and healthy.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, I've been in the entertainment industry for 2 decades. I have never seen a production that's healthy, humane or holistic.
You were like, what? What is this?
I was like, okay, this is interesting. I'm going to stay open.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be open to how this might work. I'm very curious to see how it will work. And I think all of us were sort of like, yeah, we're definitely going to see how this works. Because obviously in my head, I'm like, wait till production starts.
Yeah.
And we'll see how healthy, humane and holistic it actually is. But I have to say, I really applauded them for bringing that to the table and insisting on it, because what it did do is make all of us mindful. And actually, when we ended up traveling out of the country for one of the productions, for one of the shoots, they did incorporate some rest days. Now, the fact is, for me, it's not a rest day because I still have to do things. I've still got to organize footage, organize recording spaces, make calls to people, question sheets, go out and capture additional material to put into the show. So I've got to go out there and still capture stuff anyway. So it wasn't really rest days for me. But certainly we were mindful of that, you know. But as far as production goes, it ended up being one of the most intense productions that I think I've ever been on.
Yeah.
On many levels.
Do you think being aware of how you were not having the space to rest or how terrible the industry can be made it better or worse? Because I can see if you've just accepted and normalized that way of working, that having it put in front of you could be quite confronting.
Do you know what it is? You know when babies, little babies, you know when they fall down, if nobody's looking, they fall down and they're sort of like, oh, that was interesting. And then they get up and they carry on. If the baby falls down and you turn around and go, oh my God, then they're just like,
you know them
I'm
once.
hurt. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so sometimes I feel like it's like that because really prior to this moment, we all just know that production is brutal and we just got on with it.
Yeah.
Because really nobody's really looking. And then the moment someone's looking, it's like, well, yeah, actually.
This is shit.
What kind of fuckery is this, as the songwriter said?
So do you think it made it kind of more, it was like a
because
mirror.
your mind is
it was like a mirror held up to you.
It really is a mirror, you know.
Yeah.
Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. And it is something that I do keep front and center of my mind, even as we plan our productions, where we have control. Because obviously when you're with a major broadcaster or streamer, you've just got to, the schedule is a schedule.
They determine it.
You
can't change it. Yeah.
Exactly. But on ours, I definitely want to be a lot more mindful of that.
Interesting.
Yeah. So what have you discovered in your thinkings and research about time?
Well, do you mean in the research space, like as a researcher?
Yeah, in the research space.
Well, I think one thing I would say, having watched you on production, is I think in academia and in research, we have a very different relationship to time.
Okay.
So I think most researchers, most academic institutions accept good research takes a long time. And if anything, I would say we are in like these really bureaucratic, slow, behemoth institutions where things take a long time. You have to, no decision is quick. If you've got to do a piece of research and there's, an ethics process to get through, you could wait 6 weeks, several times over to get that kind of thing approved, and you can't start until you have, things just take time and they accept it. And I think that's just a very marked difference to what you encounter. I think the first time I realized, though, how time works in these institutions was when I started my PhD. So I was in a very, very fortunate and lucky position because I got a scholarship for my PhD, which meant I got funding to do it. And that funding was like a total game changer for me in my life. Because up until that point, any studying I'd done, I didn't go to university at first, I went to work. And then after I was into my work, I decided to do a master's in the evening. So I had this experience of very limited time to do my day job, very limited time to do my study. I had no evenings, no weekends. I was just always working. Suddenly I had this scholarship and there was all this time on my hands. But the first realization was, okay, they fund you and they tell you that your PhD funding is for 3 years. But in reality, when you arrive, they say to you, no one actually finishes in 3 years. They all take 4 years. So there's this,
a free year.
Yeah. So you have this really weird situation where you're like told this thing takes time, but the time isn't resourced. So that the year at the end, they call it your writing up year. They expect that you will, I don't know, self-fund that or what they will do with that. But essentially, if you don't have a lot of money, a lot of privilege or some way to fund that, it's an acceptance that you have to crunch this thing into really 3 years.
That's kind of crazy, because when I think about the entertainment industry, yes, it's intense, but they tell the truth.
Yeah.
This is what it is. These are the hours it's going to be. And this is how people work. There's no lies are told. You're not under any illusions that you're going to go in there and it's going to be easy and you're going to rest or anything like that. Whereas it sounds like the research space tells you that you've got all this time and you've got space to think, deep work, Norwegian prawns. And then...
Not Norwegian prawns.
You know what I mean? But then in actuality, it's a lie.
Yeah, I think there is that. And of course, it's not a lie for some people, because I think there's some people who go through higher education who can go back and live at their parents' house, or they're on a very clear trajectory where they go university, master's, PhD. And so it happens at a certain life stage. But if you're a mature student like I was, and you come in and you're responsible for your bills, and the stipend, by the way, is not a lot. I was on it before they increased the costs of your stipend, the amount of money you get paid. And this was before the cost of living crisis, which hit during. It wasn't a lot of money. It was quite hard to make ends meet. So, I'm sure some people get on just fine, but other people don't. So it has massive implications for who's even able to enter those spaces, Mm-hmm. But I think the other big thing, and this is, I'm not complaining here because I was in an exceptionally privileged position. And one of the ways that showed up was I was able to study full time with no distractions, no work, right? When I started. That messed me up.
What? How? In what way? What do you mean?
The way I would describe it is, up until that point, I'd always been working and always trying to make ends meet. And suddenly I had all this time on my hands, just the luxury of studying. And so stuff I had ignored or not had the space to deal with for years just came up. So I was studying race and racism inside organizations. You start talking to people and they tell you their traumatic stories, like the heavy emotional content you were talking about. As soon as they start telling you that, you start reliving all of your experiences. In the world before my PhD, I wouldn't have had time to do that reliving. I'd have just had to go to my next appointment, my next thing. So suddenly I had this massive open space where I was looking at stuff, and all this traumatic stuff from life growing up was coming up for me to look at. I had to face it suddenly. And so the thing that happened for me also, you face a lot of nonsense in academia. Like I remember going to a place and being told anyone who studies race is not a proper researcher and all sorts of things. So if you're studying it, you're writing that down. I was like having this crisis, and I ended up going into therapy because I was like, I need some way to process all this. And of course, as soon as I got to therapy, it became very apparent that I'd been so busy the rest of my life just trying to work that I hadn't looked at all the other things that weren't working, the things that had happened when I left home, what it was like to be away from family, you know, horrible situations you encounter where there's no adult there to protect you, and then you've never dealt with it because you've not had the space to deal with it. The stuff, the data you see in front of you, the professionals you encounter who really don't get your experience and kind of treat you like you're a bit, you know, like off your rocker because you're struggling to deal with the emotional components of it. So it weirdly, having time sent me into this space that I basically couldn't run away from myself or my life, you know?
And you know what? I think a lot of people would be in that situation if they were given large amounts of time with nothing to do in it, which is why I feel like we often fill that space with stuff, you know, TV, music, you know, in a way, I'm not saying everyone, but it's a form of escape. To sit with yourself in the silence is quite tricky.
It really is. And then once you look at certain things, you can't unsee them, you know? And you know, the other flip side of it, of course, is that there's some people who've never known being time strapped, maybe even Roald Dahl.
Yeah.
You know, there's some people who've always had time.
I've never
because
met
they're
those
very
people.
Comfortable.
Yeah.
I have.
Oh, have you?
I've met them.
Okay.
I've been to enough. I went to a posh school for 4 years of my high school. I've met people who have time.
Okay.
I've met ladies of leisure.
Wow. So thinking about the therapy, what kind of things came up for you in therapy?
A load of stuff I didn't expect. I walked in there thinking I was dealing with emotionally difficult stuff from my PhD. And as I say, once you stop, you can't unsee certain things. And a good therapist isn't just going to deal with what's on the surface. They're going to probe.
Yep.
And they started digging. They went into my childhood. They uncovered pretty quickly that the relationship I was in didn't seem like it was totally working for me. And they dug into why that might be, what the childhood roots of that were. You know, it was a lot. And the upshot of it was having that time led to a situation where my whole life sort of unraveled. So whilst I was in the midst of this PhD, I then started going through a breakup essentially, and eventually a divorce from that relationship. And then, you know, I was really just quite a mess during that period of my life, and everything unraveled. But the big difficulty then was you've got this PhD, you're meant to complete it in 4 years, you're funded for 3, your life is unraveling. For me, that produced a bit of a mental health crisis. The data I was dealing with was intense.
So how long did it take you in the end?
In the end, it took me 6 years. To complete a thing. Okay. And obviously I had to go back and work full time. I worked all the way through because I needed it to supplement the stipend. But what happened to me as a result of that was the whole way through, I had this feeling of, you know, I'm struggling to work because I can't keep myself together. I have intense writer's block at some point. That lasted for about 12 months after a divorce. I was in despair. Every time a deadline would pass, I'd be like, I'm no good. I'm completely unworthy. And like, what even is a deadline? It's completely made up. It's completely a construct, just like time. It's like a dead line. You feel it was just horrible.
Listen, the Rastas that I used to reason with back in the day, they made me understand that these words are not good. They were like, for example, you know, we don't say understand. We say
Overstand.
We don't say deadline, lifeline.
Lifeline. I knew it. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's
they
true.
They didn't business. They were like, these languages are not good. They're designed to
Break
kill
you.
your soul.
Yeah.
And
that's
how can
what
you be
it felt.
thinking every day, deadline. So death is in your head.
Yeah. And it did. It felt like being unworthy, unhuman,
Yeah.
a broken spirit.
Yeah.
The entire time.
Yeah. But you made it.
I did.
And you made it with excellence. You got that PhD with no corrections and an award for excellence.
Yeah.
So
that was
you
good.
made it through, and that's a powerful thing.
Yes, but to get there, I think I needed those 6 years.
Okay.
I think if I had rushed through, even if I'd been capable of rushing through 3 years, it's like you were saying on production.
Mm-hmm.
When you're doing research, you need time.
Yes.
You need to be able to connect dots. The reason I got to a place that was good was I was able to look back at things that happened or I read in year 1 and connect them with stuff I saw in year 4 and read new material and then watch BLM happen somewhere in the middle of my PhD and see a world that had no interest in talking about anti-Black racism suddenly take an interest and then have to make sense of that. So the thing was richer because I took that time, even though it broke me to not be funded for the whole time, if you see what I mean.
Do you know what's so interesting? One thing I will say about my space, the entertainment space, is we do have that time. We call it pre-production. And if you're fortunate to get a budget for something we call R&D, which is research and development, then you do have time to build that story, craft that story, do the research, dig deep, write things, script, all of that good stuff. So as a general, you do have that time to do that work. It's just as soon as you go into production, you don't have that time.
Yeah.
It's like now you're just executing on what we did in pre-production or R&D,
Okay. Yeah.
you know?
So it's like a tale of several halves maybe, or
Absolutely.
2 halves when you're on.
Absolutely.
show.
If you're on the indie side of things, you may not have the budget for R&D.
Yeah.
So now you have the time, but you don't necessarily have the money, which means you've got to do other things whilst doing the R&D, which means your mind is fractured. You're not able to go down to the writing hut and have uninterrupted blocks of time because you've got to work at the same time as doing your thing. But then there's a lot of merit to that as well. I mean, Philip Glass, the composer, one of the greatest composers of all time, he worked as a plumber. He had loads of jobs, a taxi driver, a plumber. And actually, while he was doing that work, he was thinking of all of his scores, the music that he would then go on to write.
Yeah.
So there is something also about work being a way of joining the dots and letting things percolate as well.
I have to say that's what I enjoyed about part-time study. I had time in between to connect dots and I could spread things out.
Yes.
And in a way, I think because I had studied like that before, it made a PhD where you only studied for 3 years hard for me.
Yeah.
Because it was like, now this is all of who you are and you're supposed to make sense of it without any other time or influence to kind of let things filter through.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. So you've gone through this really traumatizing situation with your PhD where you're having to literally go to therapy to figure some things out that have come out in this space that you've had, this time that you've had. What helped you get through that other than therapy? Were there any other things that really helped you?
Yeah, quite a few, but I'm going to focus on 2. One of them was I joined this incredible writing community run by a woman called Alison, and it's called the Academic Writer Space. And she had this thing of, she wanted PhD students to learn how to work in a way that actually works for them. You know, that was sustainable, that was humane, that acknowledged that a huge part of the journey is emotional and created space from that. So she and her community of facilitators taught me a ton of stuff. And they're definitely something I needed in that time, in a rough time. But the other thing, which not even that group could give me, was some of the reading I did myself to make sense of what was going on for me. I became very interested, not for the first time in my life, in mental health literature, in spiritual literature that helped to make sense of the despair I was feeling. And there was one guy called Malidoma Somé, who actually died in 2021, whose work I read. And he came from the Dagara tribe in West Africa, Burkina Faso, but had been educated in the West from university onwards. He wrote this book called Ritual Power Healing. And there's an excerpt that focused specifically on time, which I actually want to read because it was so powerful and made me feel so seen. In this book, Somé talks about moving between West Africa and the West and how he understood time and how he tried to explain the ideas of time in his community. And he wrote this: "The greatest shock that American culture has on traditional people is its notion of speed. My role in our village is to be a translator to my elders of modern culture and a translator to modern culture of my people's ways. Going back to my village, I remember a social moment spent around millet beer where I began to speak about the notion of motion. Millet beer is brewed by women. First, millet is germinated and dried in the sun. Then it is ground and boiled heavily to extract the juice. The juice is boiled again for a whole day to ensure its fermentation, then cooled to ambient temperature. By the time it's fermented, the entire process has taken about 3 days. It is around a calabash of this beer that people socialize. As they say in the village, one drinks his way to interesting talk. Or, the spirit of millet beer is generous in words. In the conversation, I pointed to a circle of old people who were sitting around enjoying the day and explained to those gathered with me that such stillness would be a shock to a person in the West whose schedule is much faster. One of the elders asked, where do these white people run to every morning? To their workplace, of course. Why do they have to run to something that's not running away from them? They do not have time. I had to say this word in French because there is no equivalent in the local language. But the conversation came to a halt when the elder had to ask what this time was. Among the Dagara, the absence of time generates a mode of life whose focus is on the state of one's spirit. This is not comparable to what machine-dominated culture is all about. While in America, the newcomer thinks at first that people moved hurriedly in order to enjoy the thrill of speed. But a more traditional look at motion, at speed, quickly reveals that speed is not necessarily so much a movement towards something as it is a movement away from something. The elder who noticed that moderns don't have to run towards something that isn't moving was pointing to the idea that to move is also to keep oneself distracted. The Indigenous mind cannot conceive of it otherwise. And so the elder sees those in constant motion, going places, doing things, making noise, as moving away from something they do not want to look at, or moving away from something that others do not want them to look at. When you slow down, you begin to discover that there is a silent awareness of what it is that you do not want to look at. The anger of nature within each of us, the anger of the gods, the anger of the ancestors or the spirit world.
Ooh, ha, ha, ha. Oh, God. Okay. There's so much to unpack there.
Yeah.
And we probably can't do it all in one episode. But I would definitely like to unpack this on our Substack.
Yeah, 100%.
As an extra, maybe bonus episode or an article or something. 'Cause there's a lot to capture there. But I think for me, what hit me hard, they didn't have a word for time.
Yep.
And it kind of makes me, we often talk about time as a construct. And I feel like in the West, there is an obsession, like an obscene obsession with time. And time is used, I would say sometimes used as a bit of a sledgehammer.
Oh, yes.
To control and cajole us.
You said
to
it.
Stay on that production line, regardless of whatever else is going on.
Yep.
And the fact that these people don't even have a word for it tells me almost the natural state that we were supposed to be in.
Yeah.
We weren't supposed to have watches strapped to our wrists. I don't think we were supposed to.
Yeah.
And be constantly aware of every single second and every single minute of every single day.
Yeah. And that was what was so powerful for me about reading his work too. It reconnected me to a way I understood time as a child, and specifically as a child in an African context. Because, he even goes on to say in this piece I was reading to you from, that in the West, people have become so disconnected from nature. But nature is the thing that dictated what we did, when we did it, the rhythms of life.
Yes.
You woke up when the sun came up.
Yes.
You toiled the land in time with nature.
Yeah.
You figured out what time bedtime was when the sun went down.
Yes.
You toiled differently in winter compared to summer.
Yeah, winter was a time to rest and recuperate and hope the sun comes back round again.
Yeah. As women, we have bodies that tell us what seasons we're in on an almost regular basis. Many of us, not all of us, but many of us, right? So it allowed me to realize that this inhumane timeline that I had been given to complete a thing that was based on nothing other than a law of averages, and an average that's probably based on quite a privileged student who doesn't have too much to navigate and probably isn't yet an adult or likely to be going through a divorce, or maybe they're studying the sperm of whales in the 14th century. True story. That is actually what someone was studying. Something like that on my course.
The sperm of whales in the some people have a bit too much time on their hands.
Exactly. Not the hard-hitting emotive content you need to go to therapy for. But that's the point. It made me realize, oh yeah, there are other ways to think about this moment, and to, me not hitting a deadline is not all of who I am. It's not the summation of my worth. Yeah. And maybe if I've been forced to stop and my body and my mind and the spirit has stopped me enough to go to therapy, there's a reason for that.
Yeah, that part. This is another part that I love in this. I do love the whole thing because it's just beautifully written and beautifully articulated. But it's the fact that the elder sees those in constant motion as moving away from something they do not want to look at, or moving away from something that others do not want them to look at.
Yeah.
I was in conversation with someone from, where were they from? They were from one of the Caribbean islands. And we were just talking about, the West versus the Caribbean and Africa. And one of the things she said to me that has stayed with me is that they, on her island, can always tell when Black people have come there from the diaspora versus those who live there.
Yep.
She was like, the way they move in an erratic, fast,
frenzied
fashion that's not human.
Yeah.
We're almost moving like the machines that we've created.
100%.
Whereas their pace is a more natural way of moving. Their gait is natural, And I was like, wow. So even our physicality is changed for the worse in response to this frenzied obsession with time.
That is so funny. You've never told me that, but I remember, I'm sure I'm disconnected from it now, but as children, we could always tell who, say, the Black Britons were, or the African Americans who came to our country in the same way. We would all look, and we often, it's bad, but we often laughed because we were like, what is going on? Where are you running to, man? It's fine. Or people would get enraged at a restaurant or waiting to be picked up by a taxi because they had asked for it to come and pick them up at a certain time. And in African time, it can be like, maybe that'll happen in 2 hours, or we
2 years.
And, who knows? When we say back home, we're coming now. Now can mean anything from right now to 2 days from now, 2 hours from now, to 2 years from now. You have to read the tone.
Yes, you have to read the tone and understand also that not all societies operate on the same understanding of time. So one of the concepts that I discovered a few years back is this idea of polychronic time versus monochronic time. So societies that are based on monochronic time are ones that are very linear, time focused and future focused.
Yeah.
Time is seen as valuable.
Yeah.
It has to be managed efficiently.
Yeah.
And great stock is placed on those who maintain time and
meet deadlines.
And those who don't are penalized and severely punished, and it will affect your reputation.
Yeah.
Right? because time is money. In fact, that is the phrase, the mantra of monochronic.
That epitomizes it, doesn't it? Yeah, exactly.
On the other hand, in polychronic societies, time is flexible.
Yeah, stretchy, fluid.
It's fluid.
Like an elastic.
Yeah, like there are some societies where they see time as circular rather than linear. Yeah. So it's like things can be happening at the same time with differing priorities, and we're not heading somewhere because it's all happening in this
simultaneously,
moment.
right?
Yes.
So actually in a lot of African indigenous cultures, that is the case. We don't really distinguish past, present and future. And even notions of death in those cultures are different. So for example, in the culture my mum grew up in, it's why we believe in ancestors. No one really ever truly leaves you. They pass into another realm that exists in the same time as this realm. Yeah. And so there isn't past, present, future.
Yes.
You know, so it's a totally different idea.
Yeah.
You know?
And it's so interesting because when I think about that, I think, well, yeah, if I was a colonizer coming to Africa and meeting these people who see time as fluid and I'm there on an agenda I need to get these resources and, you know, I've got a schedule, I've got to get things back. But also these people are drawing on resources, energy, sustenance, wisdom from their ancestors. They're connected
spirit realm.
To this other realm that's given them the energy to fight back, to push back and so on and so forth. Of course, you're going to have to divorce them from that.
Yeah.
You're going to have to say, no, that's demonic. That's demonic. That's not how Jesus wouldn't do that. Jesus was very time efficient.
Was he?
When there was water that had to be turned to wine, he was there and present.
White Jesus was.
He really was. He was even
snap of a finger.
That part, right? I'm jesting, but it would be important to divorce them from that because that's not a controllable society.
It's
that's
not
a society
a resource
that moves to its own rhythm, a natural rhythm.
Yeah.
You know?
Exactly. And that's what the colonizing project was. It was about capturing every resource, human resources, plants which were taken around the world, goods which were traded around the world, time as something to control and manage. And, you know, the legacies of that are pervasive today in our industries. Yeah. One of the things I found so fascinating when I was doing my research in organizations was the way time gets managed. You know, in so many of the places I spoke to people, there was this insistence on constantly surveilling and monitoring, clocking in, clocking out, deadlines, project management.
Yes.
And these were the same mechanisms that were used when disciplinary action was being taken against certain groups disproportionately, I would say, in ways that are about race.
Yeah.
And yeah, I found that really, really fascinating. And especially the longer I went on with my PhD, I started working with Black organizations. And I noticed there were these very different relationships to time in these organizations. So, you know, for example, I remember going into a group of very senior leaders in a very, very white dominated organization to do an EDI session. And the whole way through that day, our attempts to bring up racial and religious injustices got pushed back on by saying we haven't got time in the agenda to talk about this in detail. We haven't got time. So it became a way of controlling and silencing.
Yeah.
And what I noticed when I would go into Black organizations is if there was a big item that was on the agenda and needed to be dealt with, things were handled entirely different. The day would stretch out. If there was someone, or if everybody hadn't been gathered to talk about this specific thing, they would wait for that one person to arrive.
I love that.
And we would sit in a circle and everyone would discuss. And if we got to a point in the day where we were out of time and there were still items on the agenda, everybody would sit there and say, okay, so what do we do now? And they would decide, okay, we need another conversation, or actually we didn't follow the agenda exactly, but it turns out we ticked everything off. It's
you know what
really
I find
fascinating.
interesting, because I feel like that obviously fits with the polychronic way of being.
Yeah.
And actually one of the facets of polychronic time is that its foundation is relationship. Relationship is the top priority.
Yeah.
We go together.
Yes.
And we do it together and we figure it out. If you're a bit slower than I am, then I'm actually going to slow down so that you can keep up. And we're going to do this thing collectively and ensure that our relationship is intact.
Yeah.
This doesn't dictate this.
Yeah.
We
dictate time. We control it, not it controls us.
Right.
And we do it in ways that are humane.
Yes.
You know? And I don't want to make that a fantasy because...
No, because there are problems.
There are problems. You know, there's another thing that happened in those organizations, which is many of the black people who said, you know, why can't we manage time like white people? Why don't we stick to the agenda? Why doesn't everyone turn up on time? And I was always like, is this internalized racism? Or is there, you know, sometimes you do need agreements about time.
I do. And I don't think it's internalized racism.
I don't know.
Yeah, I just think... sometimes it's also good to be aware that people do have other things to do, for example.
And you need to respect people's time.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. But yeah, I think that's a brilliant excerpt. And I think I want to read the whole book. Yeah. And of course, we'll link to it as well in the description and in the show notes. Yeah. I am reflecting on the routine I read at the beginning, Roald Dahl's working routine. Mm-hmm. And having discussed the things that we've discussed, the one thing that really stands out to me about him and his routine is that he was doing one thing.
Yep.
He was writing books. Mm-hmm.
Just
writing books.
Yeah.
His mind was focused. It was not fragmented.
Yep.
He just had the one thing to do. And in this age where everybody's trying to be all things to all people, multi-hyphenates.
At all times.
Side hustles galore. Multitasking, which has been proven now that that's a bunch of bullshit for men or for women. So even this myth that women are good at multitasking, no, we're not. Yeah. Maybe society has said that we have to be and put us in situations where we think that we are, but you're actually not multitasking. You can actually only do one thing at any one time. And I find that really interesting. He had essentially deep work slots.
Yeah.
That first 1.5 hours was a deep work slot, and the next 2 hours was deep work. He could go deep.
Yeah, and in between his prawn and lettuce and chocolate
Norwegian prawns,
sit down with his wife combo probably helped the things percolate.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think today I think we rarely get the chance to single task, especially with the advent of smartphones,
social media, divided attention all the time.
Yeah, you're constantly doing this.
Yeah.
It's so funny because this year I instituted this idea of deep work and actually blocking out deep work slots into my calendar so that they're there. And there's, it's not like I'm trying to fit it in on the week. It's just there every week.
Yeah.
And the first few weeks, one thing I noticed waking up in the morning to sit in that deep slot, my mind couldn't settle.
Really?
It was just
ping pong ball.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's taken a few weeks for me to settle into, this is our new routine. Almost like I'm retraining my brain and my nervous system to not be afraid of or freak out about the space that's been created for it to do the work that I want to do. I want to write. I want to develop new ideas and new projects.
Yeah.
I want to think deep.
Definitely. That is exactly the thing I learned in the academic writer space, actually. It was like how to settle your nervous system so you can actually show up for the work, and we just don't, we are set up to fail in that area now.
Absolutely. And the thing I really worry about, because you and I grew up in an age before smartphones and like the internet for me came along a bit later, like my teens. I'm
if any young people watch this, they're going to be like, they are ancient.
Yeah. Well, me and Tyrannosaurus Rex were good friends. But yeah, and so we have some muscle memory around being able to at least get back to something. Yeah. But I worry about like my godson who's 13 and has grown up with these phones. Mm-hmm. I wonder, do they have a model of what it means to not have a fractured mind and to think deep and work deep? I wonder for kids.
Yeah, I wonder too. I was going to say I doubt it, but actually I do hear that a lot of these kids get their phones taken off them in school.
They have started doing that.
If that's happening, thank God.
Yes. Also, there are some kids who've started this movement where they're getting rid of their smartphones, having dumb phones, or some of them are swearing off technology full stop.
I love it.
And I'm just like, power to the people.
I love
support that fully.
I wonder
because you deserve the joy of unfragmented mind and the joy of deep work and the ability to think
for yourself. Not constrained by an algorithm as well, because so much of what you think about just gets reinforced in that online space.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thinking about everything we've talked about so far, how would you say you're relating to time in your life now? Like both our personal life and working lives.
So I still feel like I'm trying to figure out time. One thing I know is last year it felt like I was just under the thumb of time. I had no control over it. Meetings were being put into my diary. It was just chaotic. And this year I was like, I have to get this under control because I can't think.
Yeah.
And I want to. I'm a creative.
Yep.
I want to create. I want to write. I want to do my music. You know, I need time for that. So then I started to institute, you know, a sort of ideal week based on Ali Abdaal's system, which I can link to. And I felt like I've been able to claw back some deep work. But now the issue is things I don't want creeping into my deep work slot are creeping into my deep work slots. And rather than using them for creative work, I find that I'm often using it to do deep work, but for the business.
Yeah, not for yourself, not creative work you want to be doing.
Precisely. So that's, I guess, another obstacle that I'm going to have to figure out, another hurdle I'm going to have to get over.
Yeah, I do think what's interesting about your response, though, is that when I've asked you about time, it's still about some kind of productive output.
That's true.
Even a creative output.
Yeah.
And like, I'm just going back to that Somé excerpt that I read, which is really about something quite different.
It really is.
Stopping with so much space that all you are left with is those around yourself, maybe first, and those around you.
But see, for me, when I think about that Somé quote, it feels like a utopia.
Yeah.
Beautiful, love it, but that's there and this is here.
Okay.
That's
so
the
you
problem.
feel like
I don't know. How do you achieve that? How do I just take 3 days to brew beer, for example? I don't even know how that is unfathomable to me at this stage.
What do you think would happen if you did have that? If it was possible? Like, let's say last year we went on a staycation. We entered this realm where time kind of didn't exist because we agreed to switch off. So it sometimes happens a little bit on holiday.
Yes.
What do you think would happen for you?
Well, there's a part of me that I think might have a bit of an existential crisis.
You'd be like me in those PhD years. Yeah.
Literally. I think I'd be like, would I know what to do with myself?
Yeah.
But what I do know, as someone who grew up an only child, I do have siblings, but it's a long story. I grew up as an only child in South East London. But what I do know is that because I grew up an only child, because I spent a lot of time on my own, because my religion didn't allow me to really go anywhere or do anything, I had to be my own entertainment. I had to enjoy my own company. So what I have found is when I do have large chunks of time, I actually enjoy it.
Yeah.
That boredom, I'm able to create.
Yeah.
Then I start thinking of song lyrics and ideas for a film. And
I know. I've seen it.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think maybe I should go to an island somewhere and with my pen and paper and I don't know.
Be a creative survivalist.
An acoustic guitar and enough food to last.
I see you there with your ukulele on an island making up songs.
Ding, 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 ding.
Ding.
How about you?
As in my relationship to time?
Yeah. I feel like to me, you're very monochronic.
Because I'm a planner?
You're a planner. Organize everything, start to finish. I don't know.
I think it's so weird because I have definitely been conditioned by Western concepts of time.
We all have.
Massively. But also, I have to be honest, growing up in Botswana, particularly when it was less developed, I also learned to be very free with time in a way that my peers in the West were not. So there's a mode I can go into. Like, for example, as soon as I travel home and suddenly the transport's not turned up or something's not happened, I'm not the person who will oh my gosh, what's happening? You know, the things you see the tourists do, I'm just like, yeah.
You just slip into
I
the mode.
just give into it.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, you can't, I do get that you can't control everything. Why I plan to the extent that I do is I like to feel in charge of my own time.
Yeah.
I find if I don't plan out time, my life would be taken up by other people's needs and desires.
Yeah.
And that's important. But sometimes in this specific world we live in here in the West now, my time's too precious to let anyone come along and take it.
Yeah. It's a sacred, your time is also a sacred space.
100%.
You know?
But I do wish I had more time for myself. I think I work way too much. And I wish I had more time with you.
Yeah,
that
same.
was not work related. I would hope for nice times on a beach, feeling the sand beneath my feet, watching waves come in, watching a sunset and a sunrise.
Yeah.
Just for a few days to remember that, you know, we are nature.
Yes. And the world is huge.
Yeah. And often the only time I get that is when I go back to my parents' farm, where the internet is still shoddy. There's not much happening around it. And every day we go out and work the land and water the tomatoes and every other plant that's growing. And you slip into a different rhythm.
Yes.
And it's a rhythm I wish I existed in more.
Absolutely. I loved it on your parents' farm.
Yeah.
I did say at the top of the episode that I would shout out the women in Roald Dahl's life.
Say their names.
And, you know, they're incredibly talented women.
Yeah. And beautiful.
And he had good taste in women.
Yeah.
He really did. But shout out to Felicity Crossland, his second wife.
Okay. Did the first one realise she had no time because she was too busy doing everything for him?
And Patricia Neal, his first wife. And we must not forget Wendy.
Who was Wendy?
Wendy was the secretary, or like his assistant, who would take the manuscripts and get them organised and off to the publisher.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, like Wendy.
So he had 3 whole women that we know of.
Not at the same time.
Of. Oh, you don't know. I don't know. Probably. Okay, officially we know of 3 women.
Yes.
And we must shout them out for
Absolutely.
giving Roald Dahl so much time.
Absolutely.
I hope they got some time for themselves.
I think they did. I mean, I know.
Do we know that?
Felicity Crossland's done some work. She actually was the exec producer on Matilda, the film. So she's definitely keeping his legacy alive. How much of her own stuff, her dreams and visions, I don't know. And I don't want to speculate. If she wants to come on the show and talk about it, very, very open. But
Is she alive then?
Yeah, she's alive.
Oh.
Yeah, she's alive. Very much so.
Awesome.
Yeah. So to you listening, how do you relate to time? And how are you navigating managing time in a world that's
so wild, so full,
so wild, where there's so many demands for your attention? In fact, attention, they say, is the new currency. People want your eyeballs on things and your ears on things.
And that's been turned into a resource to sell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy. But yeah, let us know. You can contact us at rigorandflow@gmail.com, and the rigor is RIGOUR, because we are in the UK. And if you have any questions, thoughts, feedback, do share. We are going to have a Q&A episode where we'll answer your questions, so definitely get them in. And in the meantime, you can subscribe to this channel and like all of that good
Comment.
stuff. Yeah, leave a review because it helps us to know what's working.
Yeah.
And it also lets other people know what we're doing as well, so it gets the word out there. And also we have a Substack that we'll link to in the description and the show notes. And all the resources, everything we've talked about will be linked to as well in the show description and in the show notes.